From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The situation we found in Kashmir just days after this decision to take away Kashmir's autonomy, the situation was very bad. We felt that the whole of Kashmir was one big jail and people were really suffering very badly.
Residents of Kashmir have entered their fourth week of a severe lockdown after India revoked the special status of the region. As many as 4,000 people have been detained. Communication to Kashmir has been cut off. We'll speak with an Indian feminist activist who traveled to the region to document the crackdown. But first, we look at the recent mysterious nuclear accident in northern Russia that killed 7 people, including 5 nuclear scientists, August 8th. Soon after, 4 Russian nuclear monitoring stations went silent, leading to some comparisons to the Soviet Union's cover-up of the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster. We'll speak with MIT professor Kate Brown, author of Manual for Survivor, A Chernobyl Guide to the Future.
Most of what we've been told and led to believe about Chernobyl is incorrect or incomplete or just plain wrong.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The G7 summit has entered its last day in Biarritz, France, as member countries have agreed to an immediate $20 million fund to help fight raging wildfires in the Amazon. They also said they were launching a global initiative to protect the Amazon rainforest. President Trump was absent as G7 leaders met for a climate change session today, but French President Emmanuel Macron said the U.S. supported the measure. Trade was also high on the agenda at the G7 as the U.S. sent confused signals about its ongoing tariff war with China. Today, Trump told reporters, quote, China called and they want to make a deal. However, questions are being raised about the supposed call, and Trump officials have refused to give further details. This comes after Trump appeared to express doubts about his decision to raise tariffs against China, telling reporters Sunday, quote, I have second thoughts about everything. Hours after Trump made the comments, the White House claimed Trump's statements were misinterpreted and that he actually meant he wanted to ramp up tariffs even further. On Friday, the president unleashed a series of tweets saying he would raise existing tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese goods to 30%, and he would tax an additional $300 billion worth of Chinese imports at 15% rather than the planned 10%. This followed China's announcement it would retaliate against upcoming U.S. tariffs by raising taxes on American products. Trump also demanded Friday U.S. companies stop doing business with China. Meanwhile, Trump touted a trade deal with Japan as he met with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. The deal includes an agreement for Japan to buy large amounts of corn from U.S. farmers. The two countries said they hope to sign the deal next month, but Japanese Prime Minister Abe said more work remains before it can be finalized. At the G7 summit, Trump also expressed his desire to bring Russia back to the Group of 7, formerly the Group of 8, after it was kicked out for annexing Crimea in 2014. European officials, including European Council President Donald Tusk, rejected the idea, saying next year, quote, it would be better to invite Ukraine. Trump also said his Miami resort would be an excellent location for the next G7 summit. One of the biggest surprises of the weekend came when Iran's top diplomat, Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, arrived at the summit amidst mounting tensions between the U.S. and Iran. Zarif tweeted a photo of himself in a meeting with the French President Emmanuel Macron and wrote, quote, Iran's active diplomacy in pursuit of constructive engagement continues, met Emmanuel Macron on sidelines of G7 Biarritz, followed by a joint briefing for UK-Germany. Road ahead is difficult, but worth trying, unquote. Trump today claimed Macron asked for his approval before inviting Zarif, but reports say Trump was blindsided by his presence at the summit. Meanwhile, protesters rallied outside the G7 summit in Biarritz and other French cities, denouncing the leaders of the world's richest countries for their role in the climate crisis and economic and gender inequality, among other things. This is Aurélie Trouvé from the group Alternatives G7.
We're not speaking to the G7, to the 7 leaders. We consider this G7 to be illegitimate. We are appealing to the population to say that there is hope, that we can and we must build alternatives to the policies of these 7 leaders who are at the service of the rich and of multinationals. Whether it be Trump, Macron, Trudeau, Merkel, or the others, they all have the same policies in service of the rich and multinationals. We're opposing them with values of solidarity, with answers to the environmental crisis and respect of human rights, and the end of relationships of domination.
Amid growing international outrage about the massive wildfires ravaging the Amazon, the Brazilian military has started fighting the blazes with military planes dropping thousands of gallons of water onto the rainforest. Brazil's far-right President Jair Bolsonaro ordered military operations in 7 states to combat the fires Sunday, facing criticism from world leaders that his government was not doing enough to combat the fires, which are rapidly destroying the world's largest rainforest and paving the way for a climate catastrophe. The fires are also devastating large swaths of land in Bolivia, where President Evo Morales said Sunday he'd accept international aid to fight the blazes that have doubled in size since Thursday. The Amazon produces 20% of the oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere and is often referred to as the lungs of the planet. Protesters across Brazil and the world took to the streets over the weekend to protest Bolsonaro, who's worked to deregulate and open up the Amazon for agribusiness, logging and mining since he came into office in January. Thousands rallied in Sao Paulo.
The
Amazon is a heritage for the world's health. It's unacceptable what is happening in our country today. And today, people are out on the street for the removal of a government from a place it should not be at, destroying our country, destroying our riches, killing the first peoples of this land.
Political unrest continues in Hong Kong as pro-democracy protesters took to the streets for the 12th straight week. On Sunday, police drew their guns for the first time since the uprising started and fired a warning shot above a crowd of demonstrators. Police also used water cannons for the first time and fired tear gas and plastic bullets as they clashed with protesters in the Tsuen Wan district. Authorities say 36 people were arrested Sunday, including a 12-year-old, and 29 people arrested Saturday. Sunday's violence followed several large-scale peaceful demonstrations over the weekend, including the formation of human chains across miles of Hong Kong streets Friday. The action was inspired by the Baltic Way protests 30 years earlier, when around 2 million people from 3 Baltic countries held hands to call for an end to Soviet rule. Earlier this week, Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam vowed to, quote, start a platform for dialogue, but officials have so far not responded to any of the protesters' demands for democratic reforms or to withdraw the proposed extradition bill to China, which triggered the popular protest movement. On Saturday, a senior Hong Kong official warned China's military could intervene if civil unrest persists. Attacks in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq targeting Iranian-backed forces over the weekend are escalating tensions across the Middle East. The attacks were blamed on Israel, though Israel only confirmed it was responsible for an overnight air raid Saturday in Syria, which they said was an attack on an Iranian-operated base which was preparing to launch a drone assault on Israel, Israel said. On Sunday, 2 drones crashed in Beirut, leading Hezbollah leaders to vow retaliation if any further strikes occur. More than 350 migrants stranded on a rescue ship in the Mediterranean Sea disembarked in Malta Friday after 6 European countries agreed to accept them. The Ocean Viking, which is run by French charities Doctors Without Borders and SOS Méditerranée, had been in a tense standoff for 2 weeks as it remained in international waters after being denied permission to dock in Italy or Malta. Most of the passengers on the Ocean Viking were from Sudan and had been rescued in 4 separate missions. The ship was carrying around 100 children, most of them unaccompanied. The migrants will now be relocated to Germany, France, Romania, Ireland, Portugal, and Luxembourg. In Bangladesh, an estimated 200,000 Rohingya refugees took part in a Genocide Day rally Sunday, marking the 2nd anniversary of their flight from Burma after a brutal military crackdown. Rohingya refugees demanded Burma grant them citizenship and a guarantee of safety as they marched in the world's largest refugee camp in Cox's Bazar. 2 years ago, over 700,000 Rohingya Muslims fled Burma's Rakhine state. This is Mohammed Salim, one of the approximately 1 million Rohingya refugees now living in Bangladesh.
They burned our houses, took away our cattle, seized our lands. If they return our lands, homes, and also give us citizenship, then we will go back. Otherwise, we will not go.
President Trump is denying he suggested using nuclear bombs to stop hurricanes after Axios reported he raised the question multiple times at meetings with national security officials. According to a source present at one such meeting, Trump said, quote, "They start forming off the coast of Africa as they're moving across the Atlantic. We drop a bomb inside the eye of the hurricane and it disrupts it. Why can't we do that?" he asked. The idea of nuking hurricanes has been around since at least the Eisenhower era, despite scientists confirming it would not work. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, has published a fact sheet entitled Tropical Cyclone Myths page, in which it debunks the idea of nuking hurricanes. Former Illinois Congressmember Joe Walsh announced he's challenging President Trump for the Republican presidential nomination in 2020. Walsh won his congressional seat as a Tea Party candidate in 2010, but served just one term before losing in the next election to Democrat Tammy Duckworth. He was a vocal supporter of candidate Trump in 2016, but said in an interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos Sunday, "I helped create Trump," but that he now thinks, quote, "Trump is erratic, he's cruel, he stokes bigotry." Joe Walsh also apologized for past racist comments about President Obama. In 2017, he tweeted, "We lowered the bar for Obama. He was held to a lower standard because he was black," and later said Obama was elected because he was black. He also promoted birtherism and made anti-Muslim comments about Obama, even though Obama is not Muslim. Joe Walsh is the second Republican to announce he's challenging Trump after former Massachusetts Governor William Weld declared his candidacy in April. In more 2020 presidential hopeful news, the Democratic National Committee rejected a resolution that would have allowed candidates to participate in a debate focused solely on the climate crisis. A coalition of activist groups, including Sunrise Movement and Greenpeace USA, said in a statement, quote, "DNC Chair Tom Perez decided it wasn't politically expedient to have Democrats discuss their solutions for our climate crisis on the same national stage as one another. Our entire future is at stake, but Tom Perez just swept aside the climate crisis for someone else to solve. That isn't leadership," they said. In public health news, a patient in Illinois is believed to be the first casualty linked to vaping. Health officials said Friday the patient died after contracting a severe respiratory illness, but did not give details about what the patient was vaping or the exact device used. This comes as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has identified nearly 200 possible cases of lung disease linked to vaping in at least 22 states. Dozens of young people with an unidentified lung illness have been hospitalized around the country in recent weeks. It's unclear if the condition is linked to the vaping devices or what the patients were smoking before they became sick. A recent study says that e-cigarettes impact people's blood vessels after a single use. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has gone through 3 weeks of radiation treatment for a cancerous pancreatic tumor, the court announced on Friday. Justice Ginsburg's doctors said the disease did not appear to have spread beyond the pancreas, and the justice does not require further treatment for now. Ruth Bader Ginsburg continues to work as well as attend many cultural events during her outpatient treatment in New York at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. The 86-year-old justice is now a 4-time cancer survivor. She had surgery for lung cancer in December and previously survived pancreatic cancer in 2009. The Supreme Court's new term opens in early October. And billionaire conservative donor David Koch died Friday at the age of 79 from prostate cancer. David Koch, who was worth some $42 billion, and his brother Charles Koch inherited their fortune from their father and his oil and gas ventures. In addition to oil refineries and pipelines, Koch Industries also owns many major U.S. companies. The pair poured massive amounts of money into funding climate change denial through conservative think tanks and politicians. The Koch brothers founded the political advocacy group Americans for Prosperity in 2004, which is credited with turning the Tea Party into a full-fledged political movement. The Kochs also backed right-to-work efforts, which aimed to weaken labor rights and quash union membership. The New Yorker's Jane Mayer was on Democracy Now! In 2016 talking about her book, Dark Money, the hidden history of the billionaires behind the rise of the radical right.
The Kochs have built kind of an assembly line to manufacture political change, and it includes think tanks which produce papers. It includes advocacy groups that advocate for policies, and it includes giving money to candidates. And you put those three together, and they've pushed against doing anything about climate change on all those three fronts at once. So you get papers that look like they're real scientific opinions doubting that climate change is real. You get advocacy groups saying we can't afford to do anything about it. And you get candidates who have to sign a pledge that their largest political group is Americans for Prosperity. They have a pledge that says that if you want to get money from this group, from their donors, you have to sign a pledge saying that if elected, you will do nothing about climate change that requires spending any money on the problem.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Questions are still swirling over a mysterious nuclear accident in northern Russia, August 8th. 7 people, including 5 nuclear scientists, died in an explosion, which caused a radiation spike in the surrounding area, possibly as far as Scandinavia. At least 2 of the deaths have been linked to radiation sickness. U.S. experts suspect the explosion was caused during a test of a nuclear-powered cruise missile. Russia initially denied a radiation leak had occurred, and 4 Russian nuclear monitoring stations went silent after the blast. But earlier today, Russia's state weather agency confirmed radioactive isotopes have been found in test samples near the military test range. Russian agencies have also given out conflicting information about what was happening at the time of the explosion. Norway's nuclear test ban monitor now believes 2 explosions occurred August 8th, with the second one being the likely source of the radiation. Norway has also said it has found small amounts of radioactive iodine near its Arctic border with Russia. Russia's handling of the nuclear accident has drawn some comparisons to the Soviet Union's cover-up of the far more severe 1986 disaster at the nuclear plant in Chernobyl, which is considered the worst nuclear accident in history. It sent a cloud of radioactive fallout into Russia, Belarus, and over a large portion of Europe. 50,000 people living in Chernobyl's immediate surroundings had to be evacuated, and a vast rural region became uninhabitable. The death toll from Chernobyl remains unknown. Estimates range from under 100 to up to 4,000. We go now to Boston to speak with Kate Brown, professor of science, technology, and society at MIT, specializing in environmental and nuclear history. Her new book is Manual for Survival, a Chernobyl Guide to the Future. Professor Brown, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Can you talk about what we know so far about this nuclear accident in Russia, where it is, the fact that the 4 closest nuclear monitoring stations have been silent since the blast?
Yes, I mean, what people are saying in the Russian blogosphere is this is Chernobyl redux. And this is a big problem with any nuclear installation. They are under lock and key. They are surrounded by gates and guards, and the public has very little access to it. So there are 40 closed nuclear cities in Russia, and this area where Ninoksa is another closed nuclear city near Arkhangelsk up in the Russian north. And when this explosion occurred, there was lots of confusion. As you said, the monitors were shut down. People went to the web and they recorded with their own Geiger counters, different varying accounts. But we think there was about a 16 times higher spike than background that occurred because of the accident. It was definitely a tragedy, 7 people dying because of it. And the doctors at the hospital were really angry because they weren't told they were working with people who had been exposed to radioactivity. They were in a critical ward where there was perinatal babies, there was people in critical condition, and the doctors themselves were exposed because of these bodies that were brought in that had radioactivity on them.
And the reports now of 2 people who didn't die in the actual explosion. I don't know if it was the 2 of the nuclear scientists, but on the way to the airport of radiation sickness and exposure.
Yes, yes. And this has caused a lot of consternation in Russia, and it's led us to think again about situations like Chernobyl, where leaders in Russia and in other parts of the world have these accidents. It's difficult to detect, and certainly you can't sense radioactivity, but it is something that has lethal consequences, and it also has subacute consequences that make people very sick. People get nervous, they don't know what's going on, and governments control the landscapes in which these accidents occur and are not terribly forthcoming about what's going on, and Russia is a prime example of this.
U.S. experts suspect the explosion was caused during a test of a nuclear-powered cruise missile. What do you understand caused this explosion?
Well, they were fueling, from what I understand from reports, they were fueling with radioactive isotopes the combustion of the missile. So that makes this missile a very long-lasting one that can be controlled, and it doesn't burn out easily, so it can sort of circumnavigate the Earth. It's a new class of nuclear missiles, and it amps up the arms race. Both the U.S. and Russia have committed trillions of dollars to renewing their nuclear weapons, and I think this often goes beneath the radar of the media. During the Cold War, there was lots of threats made back and forth, and people knew we had a nuclear arms race going on. We've forgotten about that since the end of the Cold War, even though we're still in the midst of the same kind of process as during the Cold War.
So you have that, which was a possible test of a new nuclear cruise missile, and then you have the U.S. sort of boasting, putting out video of its own test of a cruise missile off Long Beach in California, and then you have President Putin saying he's going to respond, saying that the U.S. pulled out of the INF agreement, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces, the INF agreement, just recently. Trump pulled the U.S. out of it simply so he could test that missile.
Yeah. I mean, we're heading towards a dangerous situation. In 1963, the major powers, including the Soviet Union and the United States, banned the testing of nuclear weapons into the atmosphere. That testing caused a great deal of damage. I mean, if we look at relative numbers, 45 million curies of radioactive iodine, which is a very dangerous short-lived iodine that goes right to human thyroids and causes cancers and disease and all kinds of other fallout problems in the body. 45 million curies from Chernobyl accident, 20 billion curies from the U.S. and the Soviet Union alone testing nuclear weapons in the 1960s. So if we're going to go back to a period of testing weapons, I fear that our already escalating rates of cancer, especially thyroid cancers, which are off the chart, will continue to cause a real problem for human health globally.
You just came from Estonia. Were people in the Baltics concerned about what's taking place?
Yes, people are concerned about what's taking place, but they're even more concerned about how they're going to solve their fossil fuel problems. They have shale oil as what powers their electricity in this tiny country in the Baltics, and they know that they make a very big footprint in terms of producing carbon into the atmosphere. So there's 2 green parties in Estonia. They're both on the right, and they both want to commit to nuclear reactors. And a lot of people are nervous about it. They've lived in the shadow of Chernobyl for the last 30 years.
We're going to go to a break and come back to talk about what happened in Chernobyl and what lessons can be learned. Kate Brown, professor of science, technology, and society at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, specializing in environmental and nuclear history. Stay with us.
Harrisburg.
Radioactivity by Kraftwerk. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Questions are still swirling over this mysterious nuclear accident in northern Russia on August 8th, with 7 people, including 5 nuclear scientists, dead in an explosion which caused a radiation spike in the surrounding area and possibly as far as Scandinavia. We're speaking to Kate Brown, professor of science, technology, and society at MIT, specializing in environmental and nuclear history. Her new book, Manuals for Survival, A Chernobyl Guide to the Future. So, Kate Brown, talk about what we should understand, the greatest misconceptions and the most important facts we should understand about what happened in Chernobyl in 1986 and why it's still relevant today.
Yeah, you know, we feel like we know a lot about Chernobyl, and that's what I thought when I started this project. And I worked my way through 27 archives and talked to 36 scientists and farmers and people who were, worked with the Chernobyl accident. And I followed biologists around the Chernobyl zone who worked there twice a year. And after about 5 years of research, I realized that much of what we know about Chernobyl is just either incomplete or fully incorrect. For example, we think of there's just one Chernobyl zone. Tourists stream in there every day. But what few people know is that there's a second Chernobyl zone that's nearly as radioactive as the first Chernobyl zone. It's in southern Belarus, and it was created because a couple days after the accident, Moscow leaders realized that a big storm front was brewing, and it was heading northeast towards several large Russian cities, including Moscow. So they sent up pilots, and the pilots manipulated the weather so it rained radioactive fallout on rural Belarus to save the big Russian cities. Now, this successful triage operation probably prevented the exposure of millions of urban dwellers, but at the same time, they didn't tell anyone in Belarus, not even the Belarusian Communist Party leader, that they had done this. So people lived in about 200,000 people in these rural areas in southern Belarus in terrifically raging hot conditions of radioactivity. Another misconception we have about the Chernobyl zone is that about 300 people were hospitalized. These were mostly nuclear plant operators and firefighters. That was only one count from one hospital. What I found working through the archives is that 40,000 people, with 11,000 of them being children, streamed into hospitals in the summer after the accident for Chernobyl-related exposures. Especially people in the southern territory of Belarus were wondering, what's going on? Why are my children fainting? Why are they nauseous or have dizzy spells? Why can't all of us get out of bed in the morning? So that's another misconception is, what kind of fatalities? If you look at UN records, they say from 35 to 54 people died from Chernobyl exposures. They project that in the future, 4,000 people might die of cancers. What I found is that Belarus and Russia, where most of Chernobyl radioactivity went, have not been brave enough to make a count, but that in Ukraine, 35,000 women receive compensation for their spouses who died of Chernobyl documented exposures. Now, these are just men who died. These are not children. No, the count doesn't include women. It doesn't count anybody who wasn't married. Off the record and at the Chernobyl Visitor Center, they give a number of 150,000 Ukrainians dead from Chernobyl exposures. Not 35, but the number is at least 35,000.
I want to read from your
book.
Go ahead.
We might wonder, why is there no real conclusive science? We know a lot about high doses of radioactivity and what that does to humans. That's just like at that accident that just happened in Russia on August 8th. People die from acute radiation poisoning. That is easy to detect. It's fully documented. And we have a big study from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. But what scientists will tell you today is we really don't know what happens to people exposed to low doses of radioactivity chronically over long periods of time. And that's the Chernobyl syndrome, right? And this is far more likely, let's hope in the future, that people will not be exposed to nuclear bombs again, but that we probably will have on this globe more nuclear accidents at nuclear power plants. We have dozens of power plants that are over 40 years old that are operating. So we need to know what happens when people are exposed in a Chernobyl-like situation to a slow drip of low doses of radioactivity. And what I found working through the agricultural records in the Soviet archives is that quickly radioactivity saturated the food chain. It was in the wheat, tea, honey, milk, meat. They had 100,000 livestock that had been severely contaminated. They butchered these livestock, and loath to throw this out as radioactive contaminants, as just nuclear garbage, they sent manuals, and this is why I call my book Manual for Survival. They sent instruction manuals to the packing houses in Belarus and Ukraine, and they said, grade the meat in 3 levels, low, medium, and high levels of radioactivity. The low and medium levels, take that meat, mix it with clean meat, and make sausage. Send that sausage all over the Soviet Union, label it as you normally would. Just don't send any, the instructions say, to Moscow. The high-level meat was supposed to be put in freezers so that it could decay, and over time they hoped that meat would be cleaner and safer to eat. But quickly I found in the archives that packing houses were writing Moscow saying, we need more freezers. That's how much high-level radioactive meat they had. They got no more freezers, so they found some train cars, and they stuffed tons and tons of high-level radioactive meat in refrigerated train cars and sent that meat to Baku. Nobody in Baku wanted it. They sent it on to Yerevan, and etc. For 4 years, this radioactive train filled with, sort of a ghost train filled with radioactive meat circulated the western half of the Soviet Union, no one wanting to touch it. Finally, in 1990, KGB officers buried that train car back in the zone, the Chernobyl zone, where it should have gone in the first place. So what we see are sort of a path of contagion where people were ingesting radioactive contaminants in their food and taking it in on the dust. It was sort of an uncontrollable mix of radioactivity going all over the place. Now, I would have expected that scientists would have piled into this area. International scientists, as soon as Chernobyl happened, said, this has been a tragedy, but it's also a living experiment, and perhaps we should find out finally what happens to humans exposed chronically to low doses of radioactivity. 1990, the Soviet Union was falling apart. Lots of people were upset about Chernobyl. And Moscow officials asked UN agencies to come in and do an independent assessment by foreign experts. Tell us what happened. First, the World Health Organization went in. 3 scientists spent 10 days visiting contaminated and populated areas. They came away and said, there's no problem. You could double or triple the dose. There's no problem. They were looking at Hiroshima, extrapolating to Chernobyl, and said, according to our computation analysis, we don't see any problem. Nobody believed the World Health Organization's 10-day assessment. And so Moscow asked the International Atomic Energy Agency to go in. You tell us, give us an assessment of how high the doses are and whether people should be are in harm of further damage. International Atomic Energy Agency got 200 scientists to go in over 18 months. They mostly just short trips, 2 weeks, 10 days. And they were approached by doctors, Ukrainians and Belarusians mostly, who are on the ground, who have been working for the previous 4 years with these contaminated populations. And they said, look, we have a serious problem with childhood thyroid cancer. The Western experts didn't believe it. They didn't expect this kind of bump, epidemic in childhood cancer. And so the Ukrainian scientists gave them biopsies of children from their thyroids. They brought them home. The Western scientists, the thyroid cancers checked out. But in their big report they wrote in 1991, they omitted that information from the report. They said there were rumors of childhood thyroid cancer, but they were anecdotal in nature. And this is unfortunately what I found working my way through UN archives, is that a few key UN scientists and administrators worked to diminish the story of a public health crisis occurring in the Chernobyl contaminated lands. They dismissed about most of the research that came in from on the ground from Ukraine and Belarus by scientists and doctors. And they hid these biopsies and kept repeating over and over again, there's no need for Chernobyl aid, there's no need for a big long-term health study on the level of the atomic bomb survivor studies. So that's why to this day, when people tell you we have no evidence that low doses of exposure cause harm to human health, that's because that big study was never done. There is no real evidence. But what I found working my way through the medical files in the former Soviet Union, and they went from the federal level down to the republic level, down to the county hospital level, is that people got sick long before they got cancers, long before they died, acute death, tolls. They got sick from 5 major disease categories. That included autoimmune disorders, respiratory disorders, digestive tract disorders, cardiac and circulation system disorders, and problems with fertility, getting pregnant. Women had trouble carrying full term. Perinatal babies, or infants born within 28 days of birth, died at much higher rates than before, and there were far greater numbers of birth defects. This story is all in the Chernobyl archives.
Before we break, I want to ask you about the push by some saying nuclear power is the answer in the climate crisis to the reliance on oil and gas.
Yes. If we're going to fully replace fossil fuels, we will have to build 12,000 new reactors around the globe. There are about 400 now. So that's a big upscale in nuclear power. There will have to be nuclear power stations outside of every major population point. Now, there's all kinds of problems with cost versus renewables, but the thing that most keeps me up at night is the health effects. We really don't know what the health effects are for sure. This is heavily disputed. There's been no big study. The Chernobyl records show that health effects at low doses of radioactivity are severe, and that they run through a population, causing people to feel, before they die, before they get cancers, before they're reported as acute effects, the subacute effects cause people to have a sort of a full bouquet of health problems that make life just miserable on a daily level.
And finally, Professor Brown,
productivity quite low.
We just have 30.
Makes the joy of living.
We just have 30 seconds, but I wanted to ask if you feel, it could happen here in the United States.
Yes, I'm afraid that not only could it happen here, but in fact it already has happened here. Our biggest nuclear power plant in Hanford, power plant in eastern Ukraine, in eastern Washington state, spilled 350 million curies of radioactive waste into the surrounding environment during Cold War production of nuclear arms. We're the only country in the world that tested nuclear bombs in our heartland, in Nevada. Those 100 nuclear weapons that were blown up on the American continent spread billions, not millions like in Chernobyl, but billions of curies of radioactive waste around the American country. And so we have hotspots of radioactivity in Tennessee and Chicago area that were as high as near Nevada. And what we have is a public health crisis that we have not yet fully addressed. We have rising rates of thyroid cancer, rising rates of pediatric cancers, which used to be, in the 1930s, a medical rarity. So these are the kinds of, this is a correlation. Whether there is a connection between these troubling health statistics and the kind of contaminants, including radioactive contaminants in the environment, is something that we need to address.
Kate Brown, we're going to have to leave it there. I thank you so much for being with us, Professor of Science, Technology, and Society at MIT. Her new book, Manual for Survivor, A Chernobyl Guide to the Future. When we come back, residents of Kashmir have entered their 4th week of a severe lockdown after India revoked the special status of the region. We'll go to a person who traveled there to investigate. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to Kashmir, where residents have entered their 4th week of a severe lockdown after India revoked the special status of the Indian-controlled part of the Muslim-majority region. On August 5th, India imposed a curfew, cut off all communications to the region. Agence France-Presse reports as many as 4,000 people, including many political leaders, have been detained. The New York Times has put the number of people detained at 2,000. Local residents report facing increasing shortages of food and medicine. Over the weekend, India blocked a delegation of Indian opposition politicians from visiting Kashmir, including Rahul Gandhi, the former president of the Indian National Congress. India's actions have also led to a spike in tension with its nuclear-armed rival Pakistan, which also claims control of Kashmir. The two nations have fought 2 wars over the area. While India has shut down telecommunications and the internet in Kashmir, some first-hand accounts of what's happening are emerging. We recently spoke to Kavita Krishnan of New Delhi, India. She's a leading women's rights activist in India who just returned from a fact-finding mission to Kashmir. She's the secretary of the All India Progressive Women's Association, a member of the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninists. I asked her to talk about what she found during her visit.
The situation we found in Kashmir just days after this decision to take away Kashmir's autonomy, the situation was very bad. We felt that the whole of Kashmir was one big jail and people were really suffering very badly. They were unable to communicate with each other. Any Kashmiri protests were being met with the most brutal kinds of crowd control, including pellet guns and tear gas. And Kashmiri people were feeling terribly betrayed because their leaders, as well as the people themselves, are all kind of locked up. And so decisions are being taken about the Kashmiri people without any semblance, even a pretense of consulting them, even a pretense of democratic process. So what is left of the contract between Kashmir and India, which was this special status, Article 370, is basically nothing. And so all you're left with is open kind of brutal military control of the Kashmiri people. So the situation was indeed very, very bad.
You've described the situation as under complete siege, and even young children are being arrested as an act of intimidation. Explain what you saw and who you talked to on the ground.
Yes, so we tried to meet as many ordinary people, Kashmiri people, as possible of diverse communities in different parts of Kashmir. So that included urban Srinagar as well as various parts of rural Kashmir. And we were probably the first team to do this because most journalists had not ventured out of Srinagar or even out of a small enclave in Srinagar till we did so. And what we found there was that people were wanting to protest. They were very upset, but they could not protest because peaceful protest is not allowed, A. And also the fact that in many of the households in rural Kashmir, young children had been picked up by the police completely illegally. So they were being illegally detained in police stations or army camps. And so the parents would be so fearful for the safety of their children that they would not be able to voice any protest. And this is what we found there. We also spoke to a lot of Kashmiri women and girls who were especially angry that the Indian Prime Minister and the Indian government was talking about liberating Kashmiri women. And they were upset because the leaders of the ruling party in India were talking about Kashmiri girls as though they are the spoils of war and saying, oh, Indian men can now get fair Kashmiri brides and things like that. So there was a lot of anger and a lot of sense that Kashmiri people didn't count, that Kashmir has been reduced to territory which is being treated by the Indian government as though it is a Muslim territory to be conquered by a Hindu majoritarian government.
7 million people have been confined to their homes without any communication for more than 2 weeks in disputed Kashmir. This is Ishrat, a Kashmiri woman from Srinagar.
For 12 days, we have been locked inside our houses. We cannot go out of our homes. We cannot go and get medicines. We have small children, and we can't even go and buy toffees for them. There is nothing for us. We have relatives outside, brothers and sisters in countries outside, but we have no contact or news of them. We have absolutely no information about their well-being.
So how are you getting information now, Kavita Krishnan, as you've left the territory and you're back in New Delhi?
Well, after we got back, we found that journalists have started going. So some journalists of some independent portals and papers have started doing very good work, reporting from there, although they've also been talking about how difficult it is to report from there. So Kashmir-based journalists, Kashmiri journalists are saying that the armed forces are forcing them to delete their video footage, as well as taking away other material that they have. And Kashmiri papers are finding it hard to even come out because they're even finding it difficult to get newsprint. So reporting from Kashmir is still very difficult, but still there are some journalists on the ground doing a great job.
Last week, the Kashmiri political leader Shah Faisal was interviewed on BBC from New Delhi, where you are right now, Kavita. Faisal was asked whether he had exaggerated the extent of India's control over Kashmir. He was detained shortly after this interview.
Most of the political leaders who belong to my political party and all other political parties have been detained. I am the only person from the all-party meeting which met there in Srinagar on 4th who's free, and honestly speaking, I'm ashamed of myself that I'm free at a time when the entire leadership of Kashmir is under, in jail, and all the 8 million people have been imprisoned.
Do you think, in all honesty, when this interview is done and perhaps over the next few days you'll try to go back to Kashmir, do you think you will be free for long?
Police has come to my home a couple of times after I left, and it's also a story in itself the way I reached airport and came to Delhi. Because of communication breakdown, maybe people could not communicate to their higher-ups about my escape from the airport, but I am very much apprehensive that soon after I leave from here I may be detained, like anybody else.
So that's Kashmiri political leader Shah Faisal. Right after this interview, by the way, in it he said he was ashamed he hadn't been arrested. In fact, as he left the studio and went to the airport, he was arrested and has not been released since then. Can you talk about his significance? His own father was killed by Kashmiri separatists.
That's right. And Shah Faisal, as well as many of the leaders who were arrested, are in fact people who were seen as pro-India in the valley. They were seen by Kashmiris as being a part of a middle ground that was arguing for continuing the relationship with India and remaining part of the Indian Union. So what the Indian government has now done is to completely lock all those people up. And so a lot of Kashmiri people told us that, look, those who were singing praises of India are the ones that India has locked up today. So that's a message to us that we should not, place faith in the Indian political process and democratic process anymore.
I wanted to ask you about Indian Prime Minister Modi saying Kashmir's previous status was unjust for Kashmiri women because they lost their inheritance rights of marrying a person outside the region. Your response to Modi implying he was doing this for the women of Kashmir?
Yeah, so that's the Kashmiri women had the best response to this. They said that, look, we're fighting patriarchy here, but so are you, aren't you? Women are fighting patriarchy in their own cultures and societies all over the world. But who are our oppressors to be claiming to liberate us? And it's especially galling to hear these words from Modi when his party men are actually saying things like, oh, now that, now our Indian men can get fair Kashmiri brides. And so Kashmiri girls and women would tell us, we are being talked about as though we are the spoils of war, as though we are apples and peaches of Kashmir for somebody to just steal. So this is rape culture language coming from the ruling party in India towards Kashmiri girls and women.
Before we end, I wanted to ask you about the significance overall of what is happening and what Modi has done, what this means for Kashmir when you pit two countries, India and Pakistan, yes, both nuclear rivals. Could this be a trigger for some kind of nuclear attack? And how do you see, and what are you calling for, the resolution in Kashmir?
Right. For the first time ever, India recently said that it would not have a no first use policy. So we are probably the first country in the world to say we will not have a no first use nuclear policy. And so indeed, there is a very real danger of a nuclear armed conflict here. But also, I would say that, the issue is not just a bilateral one. When Kashmir is treated simply as something which India and Pakistan are fighting over, I think that that is an injustice to the Kashmiri people, because I think that any resolution should respect the fact that the status and the political future of Kashmir, Kashmiri people need to have a say in that. And that is what we need front and center. And also India needs to, as a start towards this, India needs to withdraw its military presence from the civilian landscape of Kashmir. It needs to actually address the long history of very terrible human rights violations there, including mass graves and custodial torture, custodial violence, custodial rape. All these allegations need to be really addressed. And that would just be the smallest step in the direction of actually resolving this conflict respectfully, with respect for the Kashmiri people and their voice.
President Trump and Prime Minister Modi of India have a very close relationship. Can you talk about whether you think Islamophobia plays a role in this?
Certainly, I think that Islamophobia plays a huge role, because with the Indian government right now, they know that what they're doing in Kashmir, they know that's not going to resolve the Kashmir conflict. What they are doing is that they are projecting this victory over Kashmir, this triumph over this rebellious Muslim province, which is how they project it, to do their politics in India as a whole, and to say that basically Muslims by their very nature tend to be pro-Pakistan and anti-India, you can't trust Muslims and all of that. And therefore I think that the ways in which Trump dealt with the disputed territory of Jerusalem and just declared it unilaterally to be an Israeli capital is similar to the way in which Modi is dealing with Kashmir. And you have in fact Hindu majoritarian groups in India which have expressed a lot of admiration for Donald Trump precisely because of his Islamophobia. There's also a link between Israel and India and the BJP government in India, because the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, they really look at Israel as a model for the way Israel treats its minorities, for the way Israel is basically openly a Jewish state. They want India to be a Hindu state in the same way, and also for the way Israel treats Palestine. They want India to treat Pakistan that way.
Kavita Krishnan, if you can talk about the response inside Kashmir right now, what kind of opposition is there? And also in India, what kind of opposition is there to Modi's move in Kashmir? Can you talk about the peace movement?
See, in Kashmir, there are some sporadic protests. As I said, wide-scale protests are probably extremely difficult now, given the complete paramilitary control over such a large part of Kashmir. But what a lot of people told us is that what they would like to do is to be able to protest peacefully, to be able to protest the way people are doing in Hong Kong, for instance. They said that we would like to be out on the streets of Srinagar in thousands and peacefully without expecting bullets and pellet guns. In India, on the other hand, I would say that while, of course, the Indian government has got a whole lot of support from very wide quarters because of the lack of knowledge about, the history of Kashmir's accession to India, and because of Islamophobia, there are still protests by left organizations, by people's movement and civil liberties groups, and young students and women's organization groups and all of these. They have had quite significant large protests in major cities as well as small towns, basically making various points here, pointing out that if Modi government said that this autonomous status was a temporary provision and they can do away with it, they look at India's constitution itself as a temporary provision, and they want to get rid of that as well. They want to get rid of affirmative action for the oppressed castes in India, which is something Modi's organization, the RSS, said just very recently, just the other day, that we need a dialogue to discuss what to do about affirmative action. They have always seen affirmative action also as a temporary provision. So we've tried to do what we can to have Indian people, people all over India, empathize with the situation of the Kashmiri people now and stand up for them right now.
You were there during one of the most sacred Muslim holidays, Eid. Can you talk about the timing of Modi's announcement at Eid?
Yes, I think Kashmiri people felt that this was an especial, piece of cruelty that the Islamophobic Modi government had unleashed on them. Many of them told us, even if he had to do this, couldn't he have done it after Eid? Because, their entire Eid was spent in mourning, in worry and fear about their young boys who were in police or army custody. And we found that no one was celebrating Eid. Many in rural Kashmir were not allowed to go to the mosques, or the mosques were not allowed to broadcast the prayers from there, the speeches from the mosque, which are usually done. And apart from very small children, no one even wore new clothes on Eid. And many of them could not afford, because they hadn't been earning for more than a week, they could not afford to get home, nice things to eat, and, the sacrifice that is done on Eid and all of that. So there was a terrible sense of mourning and sadness there, and a feeling that this was especially cruel on part of the Modi government.
And Pakistan asking the UN Security Council to intervene in this. What would this mean?
Well, I wanted to talk briefly about the significance of that, because I think that for a long time, since 1972, there's been an international acceptance that Kashmir is a bilateral issue after the Shimla Accord between India and Pakistan. And since then, there's not really been that much international discussion of Kashmir. But I think Modi's move essentially breaks this Shimla agreement. And that is why the UN Security Council at all discussed the issue, which in itself is significant. It's also significant that while Russia spoke sort of in support of India, they also mentioned that the issue should be resolved bilaterally in keeping with not only the Shimla agreement, but with UN resolutions. I think that this must be the first time in decades since 1972, I don't think any major international country would have mentioned the UN resolutions on Kashmir in this manner. So I think that for, whether it will really push towards a resolution or not, one cannot say. But definitely, the Modi government has pushed the issue in the direction of internationalization of the Kashmir dispute once again.
Is there any other thing you would
And that is seen as a diplomatic failure on part of the Modi government.
Is there anything else you'd like to add for a global audience to understand what's happening right now in Kashmir, and what would you like to see, how you would like to see this resolved?
Yes. See, I think that for a global audience, I think, the tendency to look at such issues cynically, it's very important for people across the world, I think, to refuse to look at it cynically, and to say that this is an entire people that are stripped of their, basic mobility and their basic right to talk about their own status, their own future. And, they're essentially being imprisoned here, and decisions are being taken about them without consulting them. So it has to, people have to stand up and speak for Kashmir. And also they have to realize that the Indian government, is taking this. This is only the first move of the Indian government in the direction of very speedily pushing India in the direction of becoming a Hindu majoritarian country, totalitarian country. And so people really need to speak up in solidarity with people in India, with people in Kashmir. Yes.
Kavita Krishnan in New Delhi, India, leading women's rights activist in India. At the G7 summit today in France, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has reportedly rebuffed President Trump's offer to mediate the dispute over Kashmir, where between 2,000 and 4,000 people have been detained. That does it for the show. Happy birthday to Vesta Godars and Jeremy Cabalona. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.